Hi, everyone. Welcome to Trust But Verify, Maintain Democracy in Spite of Misinformation. I'm Allie Mellen. I am a security strategist at Cybereason, and we're going to be talking today about election security. Before we get started with that, I want to talk about the things that are truly critical to our daily life as people, because it ties in very importantly into whether or not we choose to vote. So when I think of what's critical to our daily life, I think a lot about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Specifically, things like physiological needs, air, water, food, shelter, safety, personal safety, employment, belonging, friendship, intimacy, connection with your community, esteem, which can be anything from respect to self-respect to self-esteem, and of course, what it's all leading up to, which is actually being the most that you can be at the top of the pyramid. But the question is, where does voting fit into this? And that's one thing that we at Cybereason have looked to answer over the last 2 years. I've been organizing tabletop exercises with the FBI, Secret Service, and other organizations, including DHS, to really test how effectively law enforcement is prepared to handle a cyber attack on election day. And we take the perspective of ruling out the voting machines and saying, we know that those are going to get hacked. Let's not worry about that. Let's worry about the other elements in the environment, those that target Maslow's hierarchy of needs and will prevent people from either voting or from feeling compelled to vote. We've held these exercises across the United States in multiple cities and actually across the world. And it's taught me a lot about, first of all, the dramatic improvements that law enforcement has gone through over the past several years in order to prepare for these type of attacks, but also different ways of thinking about the election security issue. And that's what I intend to share with you all today. So we're going to start by taking the defender perspective, which is super important to understand where organizations like DHS are coming from. Then we're going to step into the daily life of a voter to see all the different things that a voter has to go through before they can actually get to the polls and vote. Then we'll take all of that information and talk about the attacker perspective, how they can turn the daily life of a voter on its head and actually attack it. Then we'll get more into the brainstorming part of this, which I'm hoping will be the most interesting, where it'll turn to you guys to talk about what you might think to do to stop an election, and of course, how we can use that information to actually protect our elections. So let's start by talking about the defender perspective. In this instance, we're going to take the US government. So bear with me for those of you who are international, but I didn't want to go through every government. So according to DHS, election infrastructure includes things like voter registration databases, the IT infrastructure surrounding the management of elections, different voting systems, polling places, that sorts of things, which makes a lot of sense. And I think that it's a valuable list, but the question is it really inclusive of everything that it should be? And I'm going to propose here that it's not. So this is what I call the voter hierarchy of needs, which is how we can tell the different things that are required before someone is actually willing to go vote. We start with the physiological needs. If you don't feel safe, if you don't feel like your property is safe, then you're most likely not going to go out to vote. Then comes things like, again, that safety concept, but on a more broad level where it can cover things like financial safety, and personal and family health. If you need to take care of a family member or you're concerned that they're not going to be safe, you're probably much less likely to make the time to vote. And then we get to belonging, which is the whole idea of that belief system and whether or not you feel like your vote matters and whether or not you feel like you're connected to your community and to your country enough that it makes you want to vote. Esteem is similarly tied to things like whether or not it's just whether or not your basic needs are met and whether or not you feel, again, like your vote counts, like your vote matters, which a lot of people don't. And then, of course, being the best person that you can be, that ties back to a lot of these, but especially the one of the different phases of your life, whether or not you consider voting to be something that is important in your life. So that's where this leaves us, is this hierarchy to understand all of the different things that need to be addressed before someone is willing to vote. If you lose your job and you are uncertain of where your next paycheck is going to come from, much less likely that you're going to be worried about voting when you're probably very worried about finding work. Similarly, if a family member is very ill and you need to take care of them, you're not likely going to go vote. So it brings me back to the point of, is election infrastructure just limited to the things that are related to the polling locations? And I don't think that it is. Not to say that the people in charge of elections should be strictly responsible for all these different areas, but they should at least have some type of stake in these areas and consider them when thinking about how they're actually protecting elections. So these become not just things that individuals have to worry about, but actual systems that need to be protected in order to make sure that people feel comfortable in democracy. And by that same hand, they become systems that are a target for attackers who want to do things like disrupt our elections or reduce voter turnout. And it's a lot of layers to worry about, especially when you consider that 40% of eligible US citizens don't vote at all. We cannot afford to continue to suppress people's willingness to vote, whether that's something that we're doing as a country or whether that's something that other countries are doing to us. We need to think about things like the importance of actually maintaining our faith in democracy, things like preventing voter suppression, and of course, things like ensuring national security. Because although a lot of people don't think of cyber attacks as a threat to physical security, what I'm going to show you later on in this presentation is that it can be. And that's when things get real for voters, and that's when you start to see voters not want to turn out to vote, not even want to touch the polls. So let's jump into the attacker perspective on this. And I appreciate it if you guys would start thinking about what you do on election day and the different ways that you could be stopped on election day as you're progressing through your day. Because a lot of people don't go to the polls the first thing in the morning, they wait until the afternoon. And there's a lot of time there that could be used to disrupt an election or to suppress voter turnout. When I'm thinking about the different places, the different things that you can attack, I like to think about it in 3 different layers. We've got the infrastructure layer, which is like the physical components, the information layer, which is more of the communication that you're getting from the government or other sources, and then the ethos layer, which is that belief system layer. So we're going to start talking about the ethos plane, which I think that the other 2 layers are more immediate, but the ethos plane is fascinating because this is where we've seen misinformation and disinformation really take a toll. Just confusing people about whether or not their belief in our democracy is justified or is right. And we see a lot of that through social media. It's amazing the amount of misinformation and disinformation that is spread, both by external sources and by the people in the country itself. And it's being made worse when companies refused to help prevent these types of attacks or help prevent the spread of this. There is an important, and part of the point of this talk is that there's an important cultural responsibility that we have as members of any country to spread truth and to spread facts, and not just personal truths, but actual facts about what's happening in order to better our society, in order to reach that self-actualization. And there are companies out there who are using the bastion of free speech to avoid doing that. These are two examples of attacks that happened during the 2016 election. This is misinformation on the left about how you can vote, because of course you can't vote from home. But I think that these types of attacks we're going to see a lot more of in the future, because people, of course, given the current state of the world, they're not going to want to go out if they can avoid it. So if you tell them that they can just text Hillary and that's how they'll vote, they'll want to do it just for their own personal safety, which is that life and death layer of the pyramid. And then this, of course, is on the right, is meant to just sow division and sow hatred. Next, we're going to talk about the information plane. So this is the actual messages that you're getting, which can come from anyone, not just the government, that dissuade you from a specific course of action. So this is, I consider it to be any type of communication. And we can see this in the real world with these types of examples, where you're getting a text message from what claims to be President Trump shaming you into not voting yet, for example. Or on the right, you can see an example where you get a text message that claims to be from the Election Commission saying, here's the address that you vote at, which I think is very troubling, because that's not actually the address that you're supposed to vote at. And it's much easier to just look at a text and say, oh, cool, it's neat that they're doing that now. You just see where you're supposed to go to your polling station. But when you show up and it's not a polling station, or it's not your polling station, these are ways of suppressing voters' ability to actually successfully vote. And then the last is, of course, the infrastructure plane, which is really interesting because it's this very physical aspect that I think gets missed a lot when talking about election security, but is hugely important. And this could be something like the electric grid. And if the electric grid, if any portion of the electric grid, or if it's in specific areas of a town or a country, gets taken out during election day, it's going to be considered pretty immediately as a thing that will be used to suppress voter turnout, and potentially something that could very easily be turned into a terrorist attack type event. And we've seen this actually happen, not during an election day, but leave at least 100 people dead in 2003. So there is a real risk with this type of attack. And we can see a similar thing with transit, because if transit is taken down at a specific time during election day, think about all of the people who take the bus or the train to work. They take the train to work, they try to take the train back, but it's shut down. Now, they're most likely not going to get to the polling station in time, and they're going to have to find another way to get home. So it's most likely they're not even thinking about voting at this point. And we've seen this in places like San Francisco, where the transit system was infected with ransomware and no one could take the train. It's not a theoretical. And so we can see these specific types of attacks across different layers. And what's interesting about this is I see these four as the most important ones to consider at this point, given these tabletop exercises that I took part in, because these types of attacks can really impact the ability for voters to get to the polls or the wish for voters to get to the polls. And it can affect every level of that pyramid. So let's jump into the defender perspective. And it's important to take in everything from the attacker perspective and consider that as you're going back to that defender perspective and thinking about this as someone on the defensive side. Before, we had this very narrow definition of election infrastructure, including voter registration, databases, stuff like that. And now we can see that a more encompassing definition would include at least consideration of these other parts that are becoming more and more prevalent and honestly sowing division in at least this country and causing confusion. We need to take into account all of these other aspects of election security and of what maintaining democracy is. So now we're going to jump into the more interactive part of this, where I want to talk to you guys from your perspective of different ways that you can think about attacking elections on election day. And we're going to use this at the end to think back to that perspective of how do we actually maintain security and help improve our state as a democracy. So think about what your election day looks like. Do you vote before work? Do you mail in your ballot? Does anything about the current state with the protests going on or with the pandemic change how you behave? Are you on Twitter and do you fact check? Because these are all very important things. I'm looking at the Discord. And so feel free to send in any examples of things that you would do to affect election day. And there's some interesting conversation going on, at least. I'll give some examples as well. During these exercises, one of the things that the red team did in order to continue to attack was they actually created, this was all theoretical, but they created a deep fake video of one of the candidates doing something obscene. And then they spread that on Twitter. So that's an example of something that on election day, if you go on Twitter and you see a video of this candidate that you don't know is a deep fake doing something obscene, will that make you less likely to vote for them? And how does the federal government or the state and local government react to something like that happening? Oh, automated calls telling people that their family are injured. Yeah, that would be terrible. Spreading rumors about violence at polls. Exactly. That was one of the things that the red team in different situations spent a lot of time doing. Another one was affecting the traffic system. So to cause traffic jams or to cause confusion. Calling a gas leak at select polling locations. That is a very scary one. Potential bomb threats, definitely. Yeah, I think what's really interesting is the social media disinformation. A lot of these are ones that you could see, a lot of these attacks are ones that you could see happening right on election day, but what we're seeing more and more is that things like social media disinformation, and that's why I talked about the ethos playing that way, is the social media disinformation. It's just chronic and consistent. Automated calls threatening child care centers. That's another good one. So a pandemic, crypto cat. So now let's take the perspective. how would you defend against the things that you're just talking about? What would you do? And think about it from the concept not only of a government organization, but also from the concept of an individual citizen. Because that's what I try to think about, because I'm not in the government. And while I think that policies and processes in place that would help at least curb these types of attacks are important, I am not going to be the one to start implementing them. And so it's important to think about what you could say as individuals and what you could do, the actions that you take every day to help prevent these types of attacks. Feel free to put them in the comments or on Discord. Oh, I love that. Make sure friends and family have a plan to vote well in advance of election day. That's awesome. I think that's a really great one. Critical thinking needs to be taught at an early level. Totally. Fact check social media, 100%. I think we need an easier way to do that. Have conversations with family members who spread disinformation. Totally. And also on this front, I think it's worth noting that a lot of the forms of critical infrastructure that we talked about today are not entirely controlled by the government. Things like social media, that's not controlled by the government. And so I think that it's really important to consider the way that organizations are securing themselves. Even a lot of critical infrastructure providers like utilities are privately owned. So it brings a new level to the importance of actually securing those systems, because at the end of the day, it's democracy and we're all in this together. And we all need to take this seriously by reaching out through programs like InfoGuard to the government, and by taking into consideration an election is coming up on this day. I provide electricity to this state. I should be aware that this is happening and consider what might be affected in the process. I also have a white paper on election security. That's a direct link to the PDF. There's no gating or anything like that. So if you're interested in learning more about what I talked about today, I go in a bit more depth in the white paper. And yeah, that's my talk. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Feel free to DM me and follow me on Twitter.